the globe. It's World Affairs Roundup.
The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents World Affairs Roundup, a monthly edition of International Focus providing opinion and analysis of global events, with John Katzka, a retired member of the U.S. Foreign Service, Ann Hamilton, political scientist at UW-Whitewater who also served in the U.S. Foreign Service, and Robert Kraig, Executive Director of Citizen Action of Wisconsin and author of articles and books on American foreign policy. Support provided by Milwaukee Public Television and the UWM Center for International Education. Now, here's your moderator, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus and a special edition of our World Affairs Roundup. Ann Hamilton is off today, but Roundup regulars John Katzka and Robert Kraig are here to kick off our new season. Today, like so many of our fellow citizens, we're marking the 10-year anniversary of the September 11th attacks. Those tragic events set processes in motion that have fundamentally reshaped our society. 10 years out, damage has been inflicted on our nation in ways the plotters could not have imagined. Some of it the direct result of terrorist actions, some unintended outcomes of our own response. Clearly, the last decade has left us wearier as a nation. The question we'll confront today is whether or not we're also wiser. Well, John, Robert, welcome back.
Thank you.
Good to be here.
Well, John, I'm wondering if you could give us some sense of the climate in the months just immediately prior to the attacks. You were still actively serving in the diplomatic corps, and it was a very different worldview at that time, was it not?
It was indeed. I was in Macedonia. I was there as a special envoy. I had been retired already, but I had gone back to the Balkans several times. We were cleaning up a civil war within Macedonia between the Albanians and the Macedonians and trying to get the parties together. 9/11 happened in the afternoon, and like a lot of government officials these days, or those days as well, we were sitting there with CNN on in the background so that you're constantly aware of what's going on, and all of a sudden there's this smoke coming out of a building, and the head comes up and you begin to wonder. The response there was not decidedly different from anywhere else in the world. I traveled back to the United States shortly thereafter, and there was a sense that something very profound had happened. I mean, we've used this expression that changes everything. I'm not convinced of that now as I was possibly then, but it was a profound experience. There were things said in that immediate aftermath by a number of people who conveniently have forgotten the things that they said during those days. But it was an intense period, and there was a visceral requirement to respond on the part of public leaders, of community leaders, to show solidarity in that initial phase.
Well, you know, let's look at the run-up to that, and you know, the neocon movement was in full flower, and we've got a document here I'd like to take a quick look at. This is from September of 2000, 1 year before the attacks. It's a paper from the Project for a New American Century on rebuilding America's defenses. So this is basically a blueprint for taking advantage of what they saw as a unipolar moment. And they're saying the process of transformation, even if it brings about revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one. And this is the interesting part, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event, like a new Pearl Harbor. So, Robert, how did this thinking play into that immediate reaction, do you think?
Well, there had been a lot of fluidity since the Cold War had ended, and so there was a lot of belief that we were going to transition to a post-Cold War world, a different view of foreign policy where there wasn't a bipolarity, there wasn't an obvious enemy. And I think the neocons were in the group of people that needed an enemy and wanted an enemy, quite frankly, and Samuel Huntington, in his famous book, The Clash of Civilizations, actually tried to suggest what the enemies were, other civilizations, and said you had to have one to organize foreign policy as they saw fit. And so once you had 9/11, you could try to reimpose kind of a new version of the Cold War model, the same kind of fear, the same kind of organization around an enemy that makes us not focus on domestic affairs and which sets you're either on our side or you're not kind of dynamic. And so I think a lot of people capitalized on this event to pursue agendas they already had well developed and were looking for years before.
Well, we saw very quickly afterwards the response was bundled into something large and rather amorphous known as the global war on terror. Was that the right frame? Was that the right sort of organizing principle?
It worked for the moment. But quite frankly, how do you organize a strategy on the basis of terrorism? Who are you fighting? When do you know you've won? A strategy requires both of those things. It's a very complicated thing. The other side of it was we were fighting against non-nation state warriors. Therefore, the kinds of rules of war didn't fit this. We weren't fighting against people in uniforms. And then we had the additional complication of the criminal action versus the military action. Where did this fit? And basically we're still arguing about that today.
Well, let's look at another slide. This is about 5 years on after the attacks. Zbigniew Brzezinski was commenting on just that, the war on terror as a frame. And this is an op-ed from March of 2007. And he says, constant reference to a war on terror did accomplish one major objective. It stimulated the emergence of a culture of fear. Fear obscures reason, intensifies emotions, and makes it easier for demagogic politicians to mobilize the public on behalf of the policies they want to pursue. So, Robert, this is a little bit about what you were saying. Now, to what extent do you think the war on terror was exploited?
I think it absolutely was, and it was, and it doesn't make sense as a geopolitical position, as John was saying. It makes a lot of sense for organizing domestic politics, right, and creating this divide where either you support the administration's policies or you don't. And fear tends to make people retrench, pull back, not be independent, not be bold. That's how the emotion works. And so it created this fear that we hadn't seen really since the height of the Cold War. And it also helped set up the whole situation where we invaded Iraq. Because even if the hot pursuit into Afghanistan of al-Qaeda would seem reasonable to most people, Iraq had nothing to do with it, right? It was something they wanted to do prior to 9/11, and they used this as a rationale. And we still have a situation where close to half the public believes there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and close to half the public believes that Iraq was somehow involved in 9/11. Both false, but both sold to the American people then and still persistent. So,
well, I'm not buying it. If there was a conspiracy, it was on the part of the entire establishment, because I can read you the quotes from Al Gore and from Joe Biden and others, and Madeleine Albright was very much in this, and they were saying Saddam needs to be taken out. So they were in agreement at that moment, at that time, that Iraq was a useful thing. Now, I guess at the time, I remember, in fact, we did a program on it after I came back from Macedonia, and I was in favor of going in because we still thought there were weapons of mass destruction there. When we found out that there weren't, and we switched to a democratization campaign, we're going to make them over into good little people just like us, that's when I parted company with the administration.
I think a lot of Democrats voted for Iraq out of political fear, right? Because they thought that public opinion could be mobilized against them, for terrorism, against the war on terror. And it's hard to draw the line. Some of the people you cite may have truly believed, others didn't. I mean, I can remember working out at Bally's Fitness and watching the Colin Powell speech for the UN, where he laid out the evidence and being incredibly unpersuaded by the evidence. And that certainly was borne out, and a lot of people were critical at the time, but it became unpatriotic almost to disagree that there must be WMD.
There was a piece of that. There was a piece of that.
Well, one of the leading Middle East hands at the London School of Economics, Fouad Gerges, has a book out actually just this month entitled The Rise and Fall of Al-Qaeda, and he makes an interesting analogy I'd like your comments on. He says, when the Soviet Union in its final stage of decline, the majority of the U.S. policy establishment, the Republican camp in particular, though also mainstream intellectual and media commentators, firmly believed that the Soviets were expanding their influence and posed new threats to the West. And he goes on to say, the parallels between the dominant view of the Soviet Union during the Cold War and the present-day view of al-Qaeda are apparent. The notion of Islamic terrorism has merely replaced the specter of the evil empire or Soviet communism. So what do you think of it? Is there some validity to the old Cold War years?
Again, I happened to have been in Moscow at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and we sat around in country team meetings talking about the probability that this coup was going to succeed and that they were going to continue to be the Soviet Union we always knew. They had, as far as we knew, they had the capability. What was lost, what they were losing, was the willingness to use that capability.
I mean, it was palpably obvious by the mid-'70s that the Soviet Union had become a bureaucratic status quo power. But our establishment continued to see them otherwise and to mobilize public opinion around it. The Reagan presidency was premised on them being an expansionist power, a la Nazi Germany, and that wasn't the case at all. And so I think once you decide who the enemy is, there's a tendency to always believe the enemy has capacity and to keep organizing and building capacity and spending on that basis. So I do think there's a very good parallel.
Well, and what does that mean in terms of policy continuity between the Bush administration and the Obama administration in this regard? I mean, have we seen much of a departure?
We replaced the leaders, and we replaced the people who then make the keynote definitions, but the bureaucracies remain the same. How this is enforced, there's a pressure that goes up into the policymakers that says, this is what is reasonable and this is what we can do. Now sometimes that pressure, and this is where Cheney played a key role in the Iraqi thing, because he was buffeting against that pressure.
I think John's right about the bureaucratic inertia and that presidents don't suddenly change the entire foreign policy establishment. There's also a sense that the war on terror is still feared by politicians, and so Obama doesn't feel, he's a pragmatist at heart, that he can be weak on terrorism, just like you can be weak on communism. So he changed wars, Iraq for Afghanistan, but he feels he still has to have a war. In addition, I think he's probably aware that there's probably no chance he would be president if it wasn't for 9/11 and the events that occurred, the way the Bush administration played out, and then he's seeming to be the answer to that, calling for the unity that we lost after 9/11. Sure. It's hard to imagine a scenario where he'd even be president except for the events that were unleashed by 9/11. But you're right, there's a huge amount of continuity, both for bureaucratic reasons, the interests of the national security state, and quite frankly, because of public opinion.
And nothing basically changed in the time of the transformation, the transfer of power from Bush to Obama. He then picked Afghanistan as his war, so there was a transfer of troops to there, but the basic dynamic remained the same. We were on our way out of Iraq, and we were building up in Afghanistan.
Well, if we're on basically the same trajectory, then I think we would do well to take a look at some of the costs, and that's just what we'll do when we come back after a break.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus and our World Affairs Roundup Special Edition, looking at 9/11, 10 years out, with John Katzka and Robert Kraig. Well, before the break, we were talking a little bit about how the sort of broad policy trajectory that was set in motion by those events 10 years ago really has not been altered despite a change of presidents. And let's take a moment then to take a look at some of the costs in various ways. First of all, economic. I mean, there are various numbers floating regarding sort of the whole enterprise price tag. What are some of those?
Well, I know the Eisenhower Research Project, Brown University, looked at the economics. They looked at both the interest, the other spending we did around this, such as extra foreign aid for various countries. They came up with a $4.137 trillion price tag. And it was, by the way, done without any tax increases, no sacrifices like we did in previous wars. And so that, once you had the Great Recession following that up, put us in the current debate about whether we can even afford basic entitlements like Social Security and Medicare, that we ran up that large of a tab without ever paying for it at the front end. And so it's affected, 911 in this case has affected our whole domestic policy debate and what we can do domestically for decades to come.
The numbers I have are slightly different. The Congressional, the Congressional Research Office said $1.283 trillion, and includes a whole number of things as well.
Well,
but
and one significant thing I've seen out there is basically it's 20% of the national debt is directly attributable.
When you get it past $1 trillion, you're into a lot of money. Right. Mm-hmm. But I would agree that the guns and butter approach, the old LBJ and how he dealt with Vietnam approach that George W. Bush applied to the Iraq War, postponed the reality of the costs of that war and also of Afghanistan. And it was only the economic downturn that recently came that brought it into highlight. I would not say it was the only factor that is causing this thing. There's a number of factors that are causing our relook at entitlements as well as a whole range of things.
Well, you know, interestingly enough, a few years after the attacks, in one of his Al Jazeera distributed comments, bin Laden himself said the ultimate goal was the bleeding of America to the point of bankruptcy. I mean, do you think the plotters foresaw this kind of thing? I mean, or was this just a happy confluence of events from their perspective?
Rhetoric.
It's hard to say if they were that prescient, but in many ways they got what they wanted in that they cost the U.S. a whole lot of money, right, and affected the sustainability of the empire. They see it as an empire. Right. And furthermore, that they goaded us into things such as torture, such as, you know, a lot of anti-Islamic things have interpreted that way, certainly in the Islamic world, and therefore have made us more of an enemy to the whole Islamic world than we were before. So in a way, we took the bait, you could argue. There are a lot of complicated reasons for that. So you could say that they accomplished a great deal by this treacherous and deplorable act.
Well, you know, let me follow up a little bit on that notion of sort of anti-Islamic sentiment. Here's a quote from Newt Gingrich from last year during the debate around the siting of a Muslim community center near the Ground Zero site. And he says they're trying to make a case about supremacy. That's why they won't go anywhere else. That's why they won't accept any other offer. And I think we ought to be honest about the fact that we have a right. And this happens all the time in America. Nazis don't have the right to put up a sign next to the Holocaust Museum in Washington. And as a result, just to follow up, a ABC News poll and Washington Post did a poll 1 month after the attacks in which 39% of Americans polled said they had a generally unfavorable view of Islam. 9 years later, in 2010, it had jumped 49%. So the intervening years have actually, at least according to this poll, increased anti-Arab sentiment. On the other side, here's an Arab American Institute poll just from this year that says after improving with the election of Barack Obama in 2008, U.S. favorability ratings across the Arab world have plummeted, and in most countries they're now lower than at the end of the Bush administration. So what do we make of this?
It's a complicated world, and we're looking for simple answers.
There was a part of the war on terror that tried to just kind of fuzz the difference between different kinds of Arabs and Muslims in the Middle Eastern world and just make it into something like Samuel Huntington's idea that it's our civilization versus theirs, and that this was Islam attacking us as a whole, this great world religion, when it was a very small, tiny part, just as we don't say everything that happens coming from someone who says they're a Christian indicts Christianity. And so that is one of the legacies of what happened, how 9/11 was exploited. One of the tragedies is that John referred at the beginning to this feeling of solidarity people had after 9/11. It feels to me, and a lot of people have written this during the 10th anniversary, like a missed opportunity, like that was not built upon. There were new openings and possibilities. It's what sociologists and anthropologists call a period of liminality, but instead it was exploited for partisan purposes and for other agendas, and the result was a divisiveness, which Obama stepped into as a presidential candidate, but quite frankly, he raised expectations so high that I think it's caused even further disappointment during his presidency.
Yeah. Well, in fairness to him, what he wanted to do was not feasible, and what he found as a result was a Middle East that is in turmoil. I mean, the Arab Spring is still with us. We don't know what it is. We don't know where it's going. But boy, we certainly want to get on that train.
Well, and what is the connection, if any, between the Arab Spring and Bin Laden and Al Qaeda and that ideology?
It's a very good question. I would say that the Islamic world is so complicated. There's not a direct connection. Right. There is a connection, though, about they've had just since World War II and since independence, authoritarian regimes, and this awakening to the idea of popular self-rule is really a counter in many ways within Arab culture to the extreme Al Qaeda approach.
Well, I mean, it would seem one of the slogans we heard is, shortly after the attacks, was they hate us because we're free. Well, it seems to me during the Arab Spring, much of the rhetoric coming from there sounds an awful lot like they're looking to be free as well.
We're looking for messages that are coming out of the Arab world that resonate with us. In addition to that, to all of those people who say they want to be free are the people who are very concerned that their food prices had gone up 20%. And there were a lot more of them who were rebelling than there were people who were looking for freedom. But we want to, again, and this is how we went through Iraq in terms of democratization. We want to make them all over, and we want to grasp that connection when we can see it. And quite frankly, I'm not sure that it's there, and I suspect it's not.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, there were a lot of people who just came to the streets who weren't political, who were there because they were hungry, right? But there is a leadership group that is influenced, even though they wouldn't put it this way, by ideas that were generated by this country 200 years ago. So it's a very interesting irony. There is also this connection, which a lot of people like to draw between the protests in Madison and the Arab Spring. And there's a lot of interest in the Arab world and what happened in Madison, which is fascinating. It's why I've been on Al Jazeera several times, because they see that connection, which is an interesting, another irony for us.
Watch your polls.
We're winding down here, but I'd like to give you an opportunity to just reflect on how we move forward from here. If this trajectory has, in some ways, fulfilled Bin Laden's goal of bankrupting us and putting us in this untenable position, how do we turn this around?
Well, first of all, the major thing is that there has not been a major attack against the United States since 9/11. And that is something, that is a major accomplishment. The other thing is that the wars that we're going through, they will end. And that part of the issue that we have with the Arab world is our presence there. And reducing that presence or eliminating it, I think, will help in dealing with that part of the world. We are experiencing a new phenomenon in foreign affairs, and it has a little acronym called R2P, and it's the responsibility to protect. And we saw it in the Balkans, where we went in, but the Balkans really didn't matter that much, not in terms of our U.S. national interests. But we're seeing it much more, in a much heavier way, in Iraq. We're seeing it in Afghanistan as we wrestle with this dual mission of destroying the Taliban's ability to be able to come back to power, as well as we're trying to bring civil values and democracy to all of Afghanistan. So there's a conflict there between those two goals.
Well, I would give Robert a chance to leave us with the last word. John seems to be content that this too shall pass? Robert, are you optimistic?
Well, you know, it's had huge repercussions, not only all the people that died, the hundreds of thousands of people that died, but economically we didn't do enough to stem this Great Recession because of the economic position wars that had nothing to do with terrorism placed us in. We're at a patriotic moment here. It's a 10th anniversary, so people want to be patriotic. I think the ultimate patriotism, though, is to think about what mistakes we have made and have the courage to admit the mistakes and try to be stronger. We need to focus on our actual national interests. We don't have the luxury we had after World War II, being such a rich and powerful country, that we can make these kind of grave errors and be a prosperous country and have a successful foreign policy that works in our own national interest or a global interest. And so our margin of error is much smaller because of all of this, and because we're becoming less of a power compared to the rest of the world. And if we cannot see our actual interest and focus on it and think about big questions like global warming, for example, then we will decline. So this is a real turning point, and our margin of error has reduced dramatically because of the mistakes we made after 9/11.
Well, thank you both for an interesting retrospective, and we'll keep close tabs on our margin of error in coming weeks here on International Focus. To our viewers, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,